Welcome to FO Talks. I'm Christopher Roper Schell, contributing editor to Fair Observer. And I'm here today with Lieutenant General Ajay Kumar Singh. General Singh has had an extraordinary career with top positions, both in the military and civilian administration. More pertinently for us, he is from the Armored Corps and is a tank expert. He is trained both with the Staff College, Cambridge of the UK, and the Malinovsky Military Armed Forces Academy, Moscow. Basically, he has trained both with NATO and the Soviet Union. So let's get cracking and gain some insight on the Ukraine-Russian war. General?
Chris, privileged to be here with you, the Fair Observer. As an opening statement, let me say my affair with the tank goes back many decades. When I joined my regiment, 7th Light Cavalry, as a tank troop leader, in charge of 3 T-55 tanks. And slowly, I graduated to commanding the same regiment with 45 tanks, then commanded a brigade in operations with T-90 tanks at the turn of the century, and thereafter commanded an armored division with about 400 tanks, a strike corps with 700, and the field army with 1,000 tanks. So let me say, I don't consider myself an expert despite this long innings. So people who are wanting to churn out experts in 2 or 3 months training better take some note of that. But yes, I do have an understanding of the tank, its performance, and the way it should be exploited. All yours, Chris.
Okay, sir. Well, yeah, I think it is safe to say that you have more than the 3 months training many are receiving these days. But let's start off with a very basic question. The media often calls any vehicle with armor a tank. So to begin, what exactly is a tank?
Chris, in simple words, it is an armored vehicle with high mobility, mostly on tracks, to enable cross-country move across rough terrain, combined with heavy protection and an ability to deliver devastating fire on the chosen objective. No other weapon system combines the three in the manner that the tank does. So it's a combination of mobility, firepower, and protection all rolled into one vehicle. All other armored vehicles are in supporting role to the tank being the centerpiece, closely followed by infantry in infantry combat vehicles. You have self-propelled artillery, air defense, engineers, communications, and that forms the combined arms team. So when you look at a tank, don't look at it as a duel between 2 gladiators, tank versus tank. That's how most people look at it. But it's the way that a tank is brought to battle along with the complements. And the best way to exemplify is from the Navy. When you have an aircraft carrier, it's the most potent force on the waters. But the aircraft carrier is greatly vulnerable if not accompanied by a vast armada of ships who are doing various jobs. So I would say that when you look at a tank, while it is the centerpiece, it cannot be divorced from other complements that accompany it. In most armies, tank units are considered elite units. And tank men, if I may say, walk with a swagger that is only typical.
Well, I think we're going to get to the necessity of that full complement later on. But now that we know what a tank actually is, what sort of tanks have we seen in the fighting in Ukraine? In Ukraine?
Well, to start with, when this war or special military operation, as the Russians call it, started, the tanks involved were mainly Russian origin tanks, both with Russia as also with Ukraine, because Ukraine was carrying legacy tanks from the Soviet Union days. The initial Russian offensive on very wide front made some good progress, but then soon stalled. In fact, I was quite surprised and taken aback to see the way they were employing their tanks in stand-alone mode without the complement of the combined arms. I thought they were masters and originators of the combined. And I was wondering as to why it happened. And then slowly, I have come to a conclusion that initially they were quite confused. There was a mismatch between what the political strategic authority, the top authority wanted, and what the military was supposed to do.
There was a mismatch between the soldiers on the Russian side, the soldiers and their political leadership.
Not just soldiers. I thought that they went into Ukraine hoping that it will not be a war, but they will be welcome towards a regime change.
I see.
And therefore, there was a focus on not causing destruction or taking human lives. And that handicapped them. I can't imagine an experienced force like the Russians lining up tanks over 80 kilometers, one behind the other on the roads, with no complement to protect their flanks. And that's how the Ukrainians, who had been trained quite well by the Western powers, had a field day using the javelin anti-tank systems, the systems supplied by other NATO countries, and also the drones. But soon the Russians got their act together. They are good learners. And if you look at history, the start of any campaign by Russia has been quite disastrous and muddy, every campaign. But slowly they picked up. Firstly, they shortened the frontage on which they were operating and confined it only to the Donbass and the southern regions. And number two, they then started doing things deliberately. And I think today, the armed forces of Russia have a far freer hand to operate compared to what they were doing in the initial stages. Presently, I think the Russians have been quite conscious of incurring casualties. Casualties not only to human lives, but also to their tanks. And therefore, they have changed their strategy. The strategy today, you see, tanks always have a relationship between fire and maneuver. Ideally, a tankman doesn't want to get involved in a firefight and would like to maneuver his forces to a position of advantage. But today, the Russians have decided that it is firepower that will do the initial onslaught, and maneuver can follow after the firepower has broken.
Sure. And we're going to get into some of those in a moment. But from a basic standpoint, are the Russians mostly using their T-72 tanks?
In the initial phase, I did not see too much of T-90 tanks. And more so, the modernized version of the T-90 tanks, which I may say has an upgraded engine of 1,000 horsepower, giving it better mobility, better fire control systems, as also the active protection system. In fact, most of their tanks were without the active protection system. But the tanks that they are using now, I notice most of them have the active protection system, and the frontline tanks are generally the upgraded and modernized version of the T-90 tanks, which is more potent than the original.
So they're using T-90 variants, and I know there are at least some T-72s. Are the Ukrainians mostly using what they can get off the battlefield, and then the bulk of what they have consists largely of T-64s? I mean, I suppose what I'm getting at is the playing field somewhat uneven with the Russians using a slightly more advanced tank while the Ukrainians are sticking, with the T-64s and grabbing the.
I would concur with your observation.
Okay.
I don't think the Ukrainian tank force is in any position to contest the Russian mechanized forces as of today for two reasons. One is that their tanks are vintage tanks. Number two, there is a large gap in the combined arms team that they are supposed to have. They have poor air defense. They have weaker artillery systems. They have weaker electronic warfare. Despite the support of the Western countries, I think Russia has the advantage on that. And therefore, I'm also surprised there's a debate going on whether the Russians have unleashed their present counteroffensive in Donbass or in the southern regions.
And actually, we're going to get that in a second. But for now, what's your overall impression of the role tanks have played in this conflict? How has the use of tanks evolved even during this conflict?
Initially, the tanks used by Russia marched towards their objectives as though they were in a training exercise and not in operations. And soon they were put through a reality check when they started facing difficulties with the anti-tank systems and small teams of Ukrainians that were operating and the drones that took a heavy toll on the tanks. I haven't really come across a tank versus tank battle between Ukrainian tanks and the Russian mechanized forces, because the Ukrainians found it convenient to use their handheld weapon systems and low-cost drones to inflict casualties rather than expose their armor. But today, the Russians have learned well, and you can see that the tanks are a very integral component of both their defensive and offensive operations, except for the fact that I would have expected them to focus a little more on maneuver, but I think they are being cautious and they are using them. They're using firepower to suppress the enemy before getting tanks moving into the battle.
So what you're saying, sir, is that they have effectively, the Russians have effectively evolved their tactics, but in the recent 3-week battle at Volatile, the Ukrainians are saying it's the biggest tank battle of the war so far, and it seems to have been a pretty significant setback for Russia. Russia lost at least 130 tanks, according to Ukrainians. And the Russians, in this case, progressed forward in columns, right into ambushes, just like they did at the beginning. And so mines, anti-tank missiles, they all produce the same outcome for the Russians. And I don't know if you've seen it, sir, but there's a video of one Russian tank crossing, getting blown up by a mine, and the tank right behind it just goes alongside of it and gets blown up by another mine, which has kind of baffled anybody who's watched this. So to return to what you said, are the Russians actually taking any lessons to heart, or to be fair, was this more of a new conscript problem? Because I also understand in this battle, there were a lot of green conscripts. Many of them were tank commanders who had done something entirely different just before.
Just 2 points. One is that the tank is as good as the tankman who's inside. So I think if the tankmen are not properly trained and you're using green armed conscripts in your tanks, then there will be problems. Because it takes a long time to exploit the tank to its optimum potential. But let me add a word of caution. What we are seeing in the media and on social media is the Western version of most battles. I don't think we will be able to do a fair analysis till such time that this conflict ends and we are able to get a version from the other side also. I have particularly noticed that many of such videos have been slapped together and you can make out. In that in the first shot, the tank was different. In the last shot, when it is being killed, it's a different tank. So, yes, they are learning on the job, but they are cautious. At the moment, the Russians, you see, we'll come to that question as to what is the philosophy difference between how the Eastern Bloc used to exploit and now the Russians, and the way that the Western side exploits its forces. So, yes, they are learning the hard way, but certainly there is an overwhelming superiority today with the Russians.
Well, you brought up a second ago some of these effective anti-tank tactics the Ukrainians are using. I believe you mentioned the javelin, the switchblades come to mind. The Ukrainians seem very keen on those. On February 24th, the U.S. announced an additional aid package that is going to include some of the 600 series switchblades, which are anti-armor and will be significant. And then drones, of course. So tanks appear to be falling on a pretty regular basis to much cheaper weaponry. What's your take on these threats and their effectiveness against tanks?
You see, there is no weapon system on the battlefield that is invincible. Every weapon system has a strength and a vulnerability. So does the tank. If the tank is operating without supporting complements of the combined arms, then it gets vulnerable to such small arms, small teams of javelin and so on. However, in open terrain, these small teams have severe limitations. They are vulnerable to a whole lot of effects, starting with air, starting with attack helicopters, starting with precision and prophylactic artillery fire to degrade them. And I think if the tanks are accompanied by mechanized infantry on the infantry combat vehicles, when they arrive in an area which is slightly congested, the infantry will come to the fore. So I don't think we will see a repeat of what happened in the initial stages. Again, let me give you another example. The drones, including the armed drones, had a devastating effect on Russian tanks in the initial stages, the first week, 10 days of war. Today, the Russians have virtually neutralized that threat, and you don't hear much of drones being used by the Ukrainians against mechanized forces. Yes, they are using them for information, for reconnaissance, etc. But how did the Russians do? You see, first is you do an intelligence assessment of the battlefield. You analyze where are the likely drone sites, etc., where they will be used from, and you use air and prophylactic artillery fire to suppress them. Number two, the moment a drone is sighted, and the Russians have a very good, effective surveillance system, I think the air defense and electronic warfare takes off. And therefore, the drones are unable to perform because they have severe limitations. And I think similarly to the anti-tank weapons. If you recollect, 1973, when the shoulder-fired ATGMs first made their appearance in the Arab-Israeli conflict, everybody wrote out the obituary of the tank. It was rather premature. Today, the moment ATGM fires, it's picked up by the active protection system, which neutralizes it. You
So
have
you think weaponry like the switchblades, et cetera, that the Russians have begun to effectively neutralize some of those threats to their tanks? Because I think also the Ukrainians have been asking for Western tanks, and we'll get to that in a moment. And a question in the back of my mind is if the Ukrainians have effectively used drones and other weaponry, javelins, et cetera, to knock out a lot of tanks, what is to prevent the Ukrainians, once they acquire tanks and Western tanks, to avoid the same fate as Russia ramps up production of the Iranian drones? In fact, they're going to start manufacturing them in Russia with plans to produce up to 6,000 of them. But you think these threats can be mitigated on both sides?
Yes, surely they can be mitigated also on the Ukrainian side, but the Ukrainians do not have that effective a complement of air defense, of electronic warfare that the Russians have. I do not know if the Western nations are going to supply that. And the critical difference is in the massive firepower that Russia possesses. For every 6,000 rounds that Ukrainians fire on a daily basis, approximately, my understanding is Russians fire 10 times more, 60,000 rounds. So,
sure, there's some discussion that even the Russian stockpiles are becoming, if not exhausted, maybe a little depleted. So
yes.
Yeah, there certainly is just absolute strength in number and power. But I want to get to this dichotomy of disproportionate tank force. The Ukrainians have been asking for Western tanks. They have been asking for Leopards, Challengers, the M1 Abrams. And it looks like they're going to get some, not as many as they want, without a doubt. But what makes these Western tanks different from Russian tanks?
Let me say there are two different philosophies at work. The first is let me talk of the way that the Eastern Bloc countries, now the Russians, use their tanks. They treat warfare more as a science, an exactitude, rather than an art. Okay. Therefore, in that science, what matters is the mass and not the individual. So they want a certain effect at the objective. They will use a certain mass to create that effect. And they have the numbers. Therefore, the individual tank and the crews do not matter. The outcome of a tactical battle is subservient to the operational objective. So long as the operational objective of the higher commander is met, the tactical battle doesn't matter. Come to the Western side. The Western side has always treated use of force as an art rather than a science. And therefore, the focus is on the individual, on individual initiative. And the tank designs also reflect the same. The Russian use conscripts, and therefore the tanks are very simple to operate. The Western side, on the other hand, believes in the individual mastering a complex piece of equipment. Let me give you an example, Chris. Sometime back, when I was in service, about a decade back, I had a meeting with a customer from Middle East who was trying, I won't name the country, they were trying out for both the M1 Abraham and the T-90 tanks in the summer months. And so he did share the strengths and vulnerabilities of each, didn't give me a conclusion. But one thing that he said struck a chord. He said at the end of the day, when we brought the tanks back to harbor, the next morning, if we were to start at 8 a.m., The Russian crew would reach at 7:45. They will dust the tank, open the hatches, and start. The Western or the Abraham tank crew with supporting elements had to arrive at least an hour before to prepare the tank for battle. It's a complex piece of machinery. It is not a magic weapon that will transform the operation in Ukraine. For many reasons.
So Germany's sending 14 Leopards. They said they might send more. The UK has pledged 14 Challenger 2Ss. Poland has pledged 14 of those same Leopards, and the US has pledged 31, I believe, of the Abrams. These aren't huge numbers. Do they change the calculus for this war in those kinds of numbers?
The short answer is no. They are insignificant in number, and their superiority is not so marked against the Russian tanks, especially the modernized T-90, and maybe in the future the Armata, though it may take some time. I don't think they are the magic weapon that everybody is waiting for. Number two, they are a potpourri of tanks brought from all kinds of countries. And now you are going to train the Ukrainians who've been used to a system of operating Eastern Bloc tanks, totally different. Well, in 3 months, you can make them understand the system, but they will not be ready to exploit it. Come an emergency. The tankman in an emergency should be able to do the things automatically because he's been trained for that. If there is a stoppage in the tank, what does he do? When I was commanding tanks at various levels, the most trusted and the most efficient crew of the tank was someone with 5 to 10 years service. He was a guy that I wanted on my force. And therefore, people who think that they can jump into a tank and become experts and you have yourself pointed out, the Russians have faced the same when they used their conscripts into a tanks who were not prepared, who don't have the experience, who haven't been exposed to large maneuvers. On tank versus tank basis also, I would say that while the specifications of some of this Western equipment, like the Abrams, the Leopard, or the Challenger, may be slightly superior to the Russian tanks in some spheres, overall, there is not a marked superiority because today a Russian tank will hide behind a small bush. That's the silhouette. There is a 20-ton minimum difference between these Western monster and the Russian tank. So overall, I think we have to be cautious in the small numbers that are being provided to Ukraine. I do not think, while yes, they will certainly add to the operational capability of the Ukrainian armed forces, I do not think they will make a difference to the outcome of the battles. More so, for every tank that the Ukrainians will field, the Russians will field 5 to 7 tanks more. So how do you equate the two? I think it's an unfair equation.
Okay, so to those who would say this complement of Western high-tech tank gadgetry, they can use that to drive through the Donbas, maybe try to head toward Mariupol and cut off the land bridge to Crimea. You think that's pure fantasy? There aren't enough tanks that are being given, and they really won't make a difference at this point.
Also, all these tanks have vulnerability. Please go on the US sites which have given out the performance of various tanks in the Iraqi war, Operation Freedom, and thereafter. There is a large number of pictures which show the tanks coming to grief through handheld weapons. There are vulnerable spots. So the tank, the Abrams tank, is very well protected in the frontal 60-degree arc. but it has vulnerabilities at the bottom, prone to mine explosion. It has vulnerabilities on the flanks. So if you can hit those vulnerabilities, and I'm sure the Russians are studying that in great detail.
Well, another vulnerability of a kind people have pointed out, this was one of the reasons why the U.S. initially demurred in giving Abrams, is that they're gas guzzlers. They are designed to...
Let me say, I have that figure. I think the M1 Abrams actually guzzles almost a gallon of gas per kilometer that they advance. One. Number two, as compared to that, the Russian T-90 tanks is a multi-fuel tank. That means you just change the sign and you can use diesel, you can use petrol, you can use...
Well, the Abrams is designed that way too. It's designed chiefly to use a certain kind of jet fuel, but it can use a bit of everything. However, the point remains that it does require copious amounts of fuel. And then you get into Leopards, I think they use diesel.
Not only fuel, it requires a strong follow-up chain to maintain it and get it ready for battle the next day. Let me also state a psychological fact that will weigh down on the Ukrainians. With a handful of tanks, there will be a tendency to conserve the tank fleet rather than use it boldly. I'm not sure what would they prefer, to use it in critical defensive battles or use it for the so-called counter-offensive that they are planning. If they use this force, they'll have to use a sizable force in the counter-offensive. It will only be at the expense of the strong defensive lines that they have held in the east and across Donbass. So I think there will be a psychological pressure with this small numbers that have been provided. And what I hear also and learn is that the US is removing their sophisticated equipment from the tank, which they do not want to fall into the hands of the Russians on the battlefield.
So you think there's a psychological component there to where the Ukrainians might conserve these tanks, one, because they'll be sort of luxury items or prestige items, and two, of course, you can imagine that if you were to have a Russian tank take out an Abrams, the psychological impact, both in favor of the Russians and against the Ukrainians, would be perhaps something significant, and it certainly would be a talking point for the Russians and the media. So you think there might be a tendency, rather than to use their capabilities, to hedge with them?
Yeah, let me say that it's really not fair to compare a tank versus a single tank. So if I was to compare the Western tanks likely to be fielded, the Abrams, the Challenger, and the Leopard, vis-a-vis, let's say, a modernized T-90, there will be, out of 10 parameters, 6 which the Western tanks may be superior. But there will be 4 parameters on which the Russian tanks will be superior. 1. And the outcome of a battle just doesn't depend on the technical specifications. It depends on the crews, on the training that they have undergone, on the battlefield environment, on the other weapon systems that are accompanying the tank to ensure its optimum exploitation. I'm not sure the Ukrainian mechanized forces would be able to match the Russian complement of such systems.
Well, maybe so, but you know, as I said, as we recently saw, the Ukrainians themselves are sometimes green with these tanks. We have yet to see, or the Russians are green with their tanks. We have yet to see how the Ukrainians will perform on the battlefield with this new Western kit. So I think it's safe to say that's something we don't know just yet. But
there's a slight difference.
Pardon?
Chris, there is a slight difference to what you said. The Ukrainians have used Western supplied equipment like the javelin and other such equipment very effectively. It's a very simple system as compared to a tank. You put the crossfires on the target and press, and the missile heads there. Also, they have trained on it for many, many years. From 2014 onwards, the Ukrainian armed forces have been preparing. Now, suddenly, you want them to undergo a crash course of 3 months, 4 months, 5 months, and become tank experts? I'm sorry. That's not my experience. That you don't make experts in 5 months.
Well, speaking broadly about tanks themselves, some Western countries have even contemplated reducing or even eliminating their tank fleets. You could say that this war is a high point for tanks, or you can say it's a low point. But what do you think the arguments are for and against this kind of move? And do you think this war changes the way people view the value of tanks on the battlefield?
So the first thing I would say is, before passing a judgment, let's await the end of the conflict. Then we will get to know what the Russians did, why they did, and how they did. Then we'll get a fair assessment. Even the US Marines seem to have removed the tank from their inventory, and they're not going to keep tanks. They used to have a fleet of tanks. But let me give this answer through a personal experience in the Indian Army. I was more than 12 years back the Director General of Perspective Planning in the Indian Army. It was my job to present to the hierarchy the way we should use the meager defense budget that we have. And as you are aware, we have faced a proxy war from on the western borders. We also had a threat on the eastern borders, a lot of terrorism, etc. So there was a great pressure on me to avoid allocation of monies for heavy equipment like tanks, artillery systems, helicopters, etc. And people said, you must realign to meet the threat that faces us. And it took some time for me to mull over it, and I came across a model where I presented the hierarchy in simple terms. I presented quite a complex graph, but in simple terms, I asked them to make a choice. Should we prepare for the more likely conflict, which is of the sub-conventional variety, of the variety that you would talk as expeditionary forces in the West, which are most likely, but if they occur, their destructive value is limited? Or should we prepare for conventional conflicts, which are few and far between, but if they occur, then the nation faces a peril? And of course, we took a choice. We continue to equip ourselves for a conventional conflict. And in 2020, when the Chinese came up to the border in Ladakh, they brought up tanks. And we had already inducted a large number of tanks to confront and stop them.
So I take that to be a sound endorsement of militaries continuing to have tanks. And
I don't think, if the US, United States, tomorrow decides that it will not intervene outside the American continent, they need not keep tanks. There's no threat to them. But for those who live in land with not so friendly neighbors, the tank is the centerpiece. And I think let's not confuse the capabilities and the place of the tank on the modern battlefield with the way it has been exploited in a particular battle or circumstance. I think tanks are there to stay, and there will be innovation both in tactics as well as technology to cater for the modern threats that have now emerged.
So I understand what you're saying, that if you have friendly borders, tanks are less valuable, whereas if you have less friendly neighbors, you'll probably need them because you'll be more likely engaged in a land war. In terms of just the general Ukrainian-Russian conflict, do you have an overall assessment or impression of where this is going?
You are asking me to give a prognosis, which is always a very, very difficult task. Let me start by saying, Chris, this is a war or conflict that should not have been. Where are all these statesmen on the center stage of the world? Why are we in the 21st century having a conflict where hundreds and thousands of people are dying? So it certainly shows that leadership at the highest levels hasn't come up to the mark. Then wars are the last resort. Ask any soldier. I'm also slightly surprised that there is a chorus of voices that are from Russia. It is expected, their system is like that, but there is a chorus of voices that are egging on this war. Where is the sagacious leadership which should say, let's stop this war and come to the negotiating table and let's ensure that both sides get a fair deal. Also, when you are in top positions, you should not box yourself into a corner, as the Ukrainians have done by laying down preconditions. So obviously, you are telling the other person. But having said that, let me say, firstly, that this is a war between United States of America and Russia. All others are supporting caste. They do not matter. If tomorrow the United States decides that this war should end, it will end. Russians will come to the table based on the United States wanting that. That is the first point. The second point is, Russia cannot, to my understanding, as I won't call myself a military expert, but I'm a military man with some experience. And as I read a lot of history, as I have been to the Soviet Union, I think to predict the defeat of Russia is not the best way forward. Russia, in my view, cannot be defeated. Yes, you can make the attainment of its specific objectives difficult. And whether Russia will attain all those objectives that it has stated depends on the amount of casualties they are able to accept. This is not the 19th or 20th century where you could have hundreds and thousands become casualties. There is, even the Russian hierarchy will be conscious of the casualties. So I think,
the Russians have sustained about 200,000 casualties.
No, let me state, I warned in the beginning that this is a Western narrative which, to my understanding, the Ukrainians, they haven't given out their figures. But knowing the way that the battle is progressing, I think they would have easily touched 200,000 casualties, the Ukrainian side. The Russians, on the other hand, would have touched 50, 60,000, how many killed, how many injured, how many taken prisoners is difficult to hazard a guess. But
so
obviously,
do you think vastly more casualties have occurred on the Ukrainian side than on the
Chris, the way this battle has occurred, the way the two forces are arraigned against each other, there is no doubt in any military expert's mind that Ukraine would have suffered more, much more than what Russia has suffered. Number two, to expect Russia, having taken this gamble, to go back out of Donbass and to also relinquish Crimea, I think is asking for the moon. There is no way, having undergone so many casualties, that they will. There has to be a more imaginative end to this war. There has to be a more imaginative solution to this war.
It's interesting, actually. Today, this morning, the news came across that it's the first time the U.S. Secretary of State has met with his Russian counterpart. They're at the G20, and apparently they had a side meeting. Now, that is not to say that they're negotiating any sort of treaty or truce or nothing there. In fact, what they're releasing is that the U.S. asked Russia to come back to the START treaty. But it is interesting that at least they're talking.
Let me say, the semantics of Russia withdrawing from the START treaty may be argued, but they have actually messaged the United States and the West that they are owners of the largest nuclear arsenal. Chris, tell me, how do you defeat a state that is owner of the largest nuclear arsenal, and their nuclear doctrine states that they will not hesitate to use nuclear weapons if there is an existential threat to Russia? So I think this war will end. Then fatigue sets in on both sides. And I don't think it will set in a hurry. It may probably run its course this year. And at some stage, I think fatigue mainly in the United States. That United States is the key. If you know the Vietnam War, the Viet Cong decided that the way to stop this war is to target the American population. So
I don't think I could coax you into an assessment of who presently has the upper hand in the war, could I?
Yeah, let me state that Russia is on the offensive, without doubt. Their offensive, which was anticipated, has started. May not be in the form that all of us were expecting, large maneuvers and encircling movements, but slow grinding operation. That's the strategy they have adopted. They have also, Chris, in my view, kept a large amount of their forces ready for a defensive battle, because they know at some stage Ukraine, maybe 3 months, 6 months, will attempt a counter-offensive, maybe in the south, and threaten key vulnerabilities of Russia. So a large amount of their forces have been kept on hold, awaiting such a move. Number two, I think, who are the losers? You asked me a question as to how you assess the present state of the two sides. I think certainly,
yes, sir.
As of today, the Russians certainly have an upper hand. They are fighting in Donbass. They are fighting in earlier Ukrainian territory. The Ukrainians are fighting in their homeland. And out of their meager population, 1/4 has been displaced or have become refugees. Hundreds of thousands have died. You do not know, there are large numbers who are known as missing, whether killed or prisoners, nobody knows. The Russians are able to absorb the conflict as of today. I'm not making a statement.
Sure.
Able to.
But even so, if the Russians have the upper hand or on the offense, as you asserted, I believe, you have to admit that there doesn't seem to be a lot of progress. Are we at a stalemate, a sort of World War I, quasi-French?
Right. This battle has now become a combination of World War I, World War II, and new technologies, all merged into one. So
now, World War I, obviously, the stalemate and the trenches and the brutality of it. How so with regard to World War II? The technology or something else?
I think the Russians are still being conscious of not targeting the civilian population in Ukraine. They are targeting the armed forces. They are targeting the infrastructure. But, can you imagine when they launch 100 missiles, if they were to target it to areas where civilians stay, there will be huge casualties. So both Ukraine and Russia should remember that geography cannot be changed. And therefore, whatever may be the state today, in the future, Russia and Ukraine will continue to share a border. And they will have to continue to learn to live with each other. Okay?
So I just want to clarify something. You're saying that the Russians are showing restraint with the civilian population of Ukraine.
Certainly. The numbers of civilians killed, as given out by United Nations, is in support of what I'm saying. It probably, at the political level, they do not want to create a situation where every Ukrainian thinks that what the West is saying is right about Russians. There is a huge connectivity that goes back between the two countries and the two people, between the religions that they follow, that goes back to the 9th, 10th, 11th century. And therefore, I think we will have to hold our horses to see how it goes. But let me say, the biggest fear that everyone has is the incremental involvement of the Western nations. At the moment, they are involved indirectly, supporting Ukraine through technology, through weapon systems, through ammunition, through providing them information using the satellites and everything else. There is also news that a large amount of HIMARS are being operated out of Poland by the airborne division of the Americans that is stationed there. Okay. But slowly, what countries like Ukraine and Poland and some of the Baltic states would like is for American soldiers to get involved in. Now, that's a stage which I think contains great amount of danger. I think the American leadership so far is very conscious of not getting involved directly or threatening.
Well, and I can understand. I mean, the Baltic states, I actually, not that long ago, drove from Tallinn, Estonia, and drove east to Narva. And it's a very uneasy feeling you get at that border. And I can understand why the Baltics certainly would want the U.S. to get more involved.
Absolutely.
And the U.S. has become progressively more involved. I mean, one of the things that we've seen repeatedly is where the U.S. says we will not send X piece of equipment, and there's usually a pretty quick about turn. So it's hard to say what the end result will be for the U.S. outside of the politics of it, which show that President Biden and the administration will have perhaps a tougher time selling the aid to Ukraine. But I want to conclude with a general question. Do you think the Ukraine conflict will bring about a change of thinking about tanks? And I guess I'll just let you interpret that as you will, either in terms of, well, let me just define it, in terms of their utility on the battlefield, in terms of where the future of warfare is going, and anything else you want to add.
Let me say that as far as the tank is concerned, there are hiccups which arrive periodically, as it happened in the initial stages of this conflict. But the importance of the tank can be gauged by the fact that Ukraine has been clamoring for tanks. It's also, Chris, a psychological issue. The other side has huge monsters which come rolling towards you, and you cannot meet them with a similar weapon system. But I don't think the M1 Abrams are arriving in a hurry. The Leopards, maybe the Challengers in a hodgepodge mode will arrive. It will certainly bolster the Ukrainian capability because these are capable systems, but they will not turn the tide of war in the limited numbers that they are being fielded. But I think all doubts on the future of the tank can be put to rest, because without the tanks, the only place that you can survive is in thick jungles and high altitude. Even in the high altitude of Ladakh, both the Chinese and the Indian army fielded tanks. Mm-hmm. So tanks remain. It's a different feeling when you sit inside a tank. Even though you may be vulnerable, you feel secure because you are protected. You have mobility and you have a gun that can fire many kilometers away. The Russian tanks, one of the advantages is that they fire a ATGM, a missile through the same barrel of the tank, which hits targets at 5 kilometers, far outgunning most of the other tanks. The Western nations do not feel this. So their range would be limited to 2.5, 3 kilometers. The Russian gun fires at 2.5 kilometers, but the missile can kill objectives at 5 kilometers. So the tank's place, and I don't say this because I'm a tankman, but I think the tank's place, many obituaries have been written about the tank periodically, but the tank bounces back. But yes, there is one question I would like to end with. Over the last many decades, most modern armies decided that they need not create or produce a new tank. So everybody went for upgrades. So you have X number of upgrades on the Leopard, the last one being Leopard 2A7. You have many upgrades on the M1. Same for the Russians. The Russians have produced a tank called Armata, which they haven't brought into serial production as yet, but it has some very good capabilities. I think there may be a renewed focus on R&D to create more capable tanks for the future battlefield. I think we are going to see that.
Okay, so the tank is here to stay. Well, yes. Thank you, General Singh, for your time. I really appreciate it. And I enjoyed chatting with you. And also, if I may say, that is a very impressive picture in the background.
Well, that was when I was army commander in a maneuver where we maneuvered with almost 2,000 tanks under me in the desert.
Wow.
Wow. It's a dream come true for a tankman to have so many tanks maneuver.
I'm sure you're like a kid living out his dreams, and that's a beast.
Let me also state that without practicing such maneuvers or without going through such training, it's not possible to replicate them in actual operations.
Yes.
That's an inherent disadvantage that one side faces if they do not have that experience.
Yes, sir. All right. Well, thank you very much.
Join the conversation at Fair Observer and subscribe to our YouTube channel.